Quadratic functions. First, we want to discuss what a quadratic function can be written as. It would be in the form of y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. When we write it in this form, it will create a parabola. And a parabola is a graph that is in the shape of a U or an upside down U. An example of how these are performed, if we are given an equation in y equals ax squared plus bx plus c form, such as y equals x squared minus 2, we would just plug in the given numbers. Now in this case, we like you to stick with the same numbers, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. That gives us a good idea of both positives and negatives. -2, we would then plug into this equation. It would become parentheses -2, close parentheses, squared, minus 2. When we do this, we get -2 times -2, which is positive 4, minus 2, which gives us the answer of a positive 2. So our ordered pair then becomes -2, 2. The next one we plug in -1, and -1 times itself is a positive 1. Positive 1 minus 2 is -1. So our ordered pair becomes -1, -1. The next thing that we would plug in is 0, and 0 squared would still be 0, minus 2 would give us -2. So we would end up with 0, -2. Then we do positive 1 squared is 1, 1 minus 2 is -1, so we end up with 1, -1. Our next one is 2, and 2 squared is 4, 4 minus 2 is 2, so our ordered pair is 2, 2. Now we're going to go plot all of these ordered pairs. So for the first one, we go left 2, up 2. That's -2, 2. The next one, for -1, -1, we would go left 1, down 1. 0, -2, we would just stay on the y-axis and go down 2. For positive 1, we would go right 1 and down 1. And then for positive 2, we would go right 2, up 2. For our next example, if we were given y equals -x squared, we can see that when we plug this in, we have to keep that negative out front. So for instance, with -2, we would plug in -2 in parentheses for where the x is, but we would leave the negative out front. So it would look like negative parenthesis, -2, close parenthesis, to the second power. When we plug in that negative, what happens is the negative times the negative becomes a positive, but we're left with a negative out front, so it changes the entire answer to a negative. So -2 times -2 is positive 4, but because we have a negative out front, it ends up making it -4. So our answer for this one is -2 for our x value, -4 for our y value. Again, with the -1, we would plug in negative for the x, and we would have -1 times -1, which becomes positive 1. But because we have a negative out front, we would change the entire answer to a negative. So our answer would be -1, -1. When we plug in 0, the value is not going to matter because we are simply plugging it in for the only value that's available there. So we end up with 0 to the second power, which is still 0, and there is no such thing as a -0 or a positive 0, so the sign simply just goes away. So our answer in this case is 0, 0. Our next one is positive 1, so we leave our negative out front yet again, and we have 1 squared, and we would bring that negative out with it, and it ends up being -1, so we have 1, -1. The next one, 2, if we have 2 to the second power, that's 4, but we have a negative out front, so it makes it -4, so we end up with 2, -4. Now we go plot those points just as we did on the last example, and I failed to mention on the last example that we need to go ahead and draw our U shape through those points that we just plotted, and we will create our own parabola. In this case, you'll see that it is an upside down parabola, and the reason why is because of that negative that happens to be in front of that x squared. Okay, for our third and final example, if we're given something such as y equals 3x squared, if we plug in the same numbers that we like you to stick with, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, We'll plug in the -2 for the x value. Now we like to keep parentheses around it just so that we can identify where we've plugged something in. So in this case, we have 3 parentheses -2 parentheses to the second power. So we go ahead and do the exponent first. -2 times -2 is 4. And what is 3 times 4? 12. So we plug in -2, 12. Our next example, -1 to the second power is 1. And 3 times 1 is 3. So we end up with -1, 3. Our next example, 0 squared is 0. And 3 times 0 is still 0. So we end up with 0, 0. Next is 1. 1 squared is 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So we end up with 1, 3. Our last one is 2, and 3 times 2 quantity squared. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. So we end up with 2, 12. We have to plot those points. So we would go left 2, up 12, left 1, up 3, 0, 0, we just stay in the middle and plot that point, right 1, up 3, and right 2, up 12. And then we graph the parabola itself, and we make sure that we end up with a U shape. In this case, you can see that the U shape is rather slender because of the 3. It makes the rate of change a lot greater, and because of that, it makes the steepness change. The only other thing that we need to remember is that if we're dealing with something that cannot be negative, such as throwing a baseball or the distance upstairs or things that have to be positive, you need to remember that those numbers are only going to consist of anything from 0 up 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. You will not have negatives in those situations.